talking about some myths about the SAT and ACT and why these tests are still vital. Um, we had a lot of success this early action, early decision year. Things are softening up a little bit. For the first time in a while, saw strong students pretty much typically getting into their first choice schools. If they had very, very strong resumes, we had Stanfords and Harvards and UPenns and Browns and MITs and Caltechs. One explanation for this trend is um, SAT and ACT are back, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. Um, uh, the first myth is that the SAT and ACT are biased. They're measuring wealth, they're measuring race, and they don't predict college success. That is something that I hear all the time. I hear it mostly from uh, high school teachers. Someone told me the other day that an AP psychology um, teacher kind of stopped class and explained why the SAT and ACT are bad. Basically explaining that um, they're just reflecting family income. Um, the New York Times, in a very detailed story last year called "The Misguided War on the SAT," essentially looked at a number of studies and critics and said, this is something you hear all the time, but it is simply not true. In the UCs, they began a 2-year study. This is the 200-page summary of the study. They wanted to know, are these tests good predictors? Are they fair or are they biased? Should we keep them? Alongside that, they began advocating for Prop 16, which was an effort to call back Prop 209. Prop 209 said you can use any metric you want except race and ethnicity in accepting students. So the UCs clearly would like to use the categories of race and ethnicity and gender to admit. And so they clearly were hoping that their study of the SAT and ACT would confirm that the test had all kinds of problems because their greatest concern was that the SAT and ACT gives them too many students from stronger school districts and too many students in categories that are, to use a euphemism, overrepresented. That means essentially Asian American. Neither one of those efforts worked as the UCs imagined. The task force that examined the SAT concluded that it would not be a good idea to make these tests optional. The impossibility of admitting people to a very selective set of universities without having some outside measure of their readiness was troubling. More to the point, the study found that there was no evidence that the UC's use of test scores played a major role in worsening the effects of disparities already present. Simply put, you can buy a nice house in a school district and you can buy tuition to a private high school, but you can't buy a score. That is why one Hollywood celebrity went to prison because you can buy the best tutors, the best resources. You can't buy practice, effort. Um, the UCs, in a move that will puzzle some people, presented the study to 51 professors who are part of the Senate faculty. They voted 51-0 to keep using the SAT and ACT. But the regents, who were politically appointed, voted 21-0 to get rid of them. They wanted to change the demographics of who gets into the UCs. And I would argue they have achieved that goal. The Atlantic is not a right-wing conservative piece of media. It is certainly progressive, liberal. Caitlin Flanagan wrote an essay I highly recommend, worrying about these decisions, saying quite boldly, the University of California is lying to us. And she is putting her finger on the fact that certain notions of anti-racism essentially mean, quote, reviving one of the state's most shameful traditions. That is a tradition of taking effort um, to essentially repress the achievements of Asian Americans. So in the aftermath of the 2020 decision to not use the SAT and ACT, the UCs moved into a mode of admissions where, to give you a little quiz, I want you to consider which of these students got into UC San Diego in 2022. Student one, extraordinary GPA, nearly perfect SAT, wins a grand award at ISEF, actually second grand award, has any number of accomplishments. The other student got about 780 on a PSAT, had a decent GPA, no real activities. Student two in 2022, I've anonymized them, got into UC San Diego. Student one did not. Now, student one got into MIT, but Riverside told this student that she should pick another major. They politely explained that computer science, her first choice major, was impacted. Um, in 2016, 119 Westview high school students in San Diego applied to UC Berkeley. 44% of them were admitted. Westview is a very competitive high school. They had a lot of students who had strong scores, strong grades, took very hard classes, and contributed across their community and their high school. The acceptance rate in 2016 for Westview students to Berkeley was 44%. In 2021, the acceptance rate was 6.7%. That is less than 1/6 of the percentage accepted just a few years earlier. The effort to change the demographics of who's getting into the UCs has been very successful, and it has been achieved by eliminating the SAT and ACT. I've had people ask me though, well, I want to go to the UCs, so that's my target. They don't want the SAT or ACT, so why would I study? Because if someone who got into MIT for computer science doesn't get into Riverside for that major, you can't rationally say, I will only apply to the UCs. You have to, if you live in California now, apply beyond the borders of our state. The acceptance rates at CCA to UC San Diego used to be around 2018, roughly 75%, and Del Norte was roughly 65%. They dropped to 15 and 11%. Respectively. Some other high schools, one of these has a 40% absentee rate. They rose to 57%. People are getting into the UCs. It's just different people. Um, the first myth is that the SAT and ACT are deeply unfair. Almost every single study, including the UC's own study, said that's not the case. And that grades are not the best measure of who is the most prepared to thrive in selective and competitive colleges. Myth number two, universities don't want the SAT or ACT anymore. For a year or two, I would find in every major media outlet some pronouncement about how now that colleges don't want the SAT or ACT, what are they looking for? That was never really true. For one thing, MIT, just a year or two after being test optional, came out bravely and said, we are requiring the SAT scores. And if you'll notice their announcement, in order to help us continue to build a diverse and talented MIT. Most of the Ivies have followed suit. Most of the selective universities require the SAT and ACT. So it is simply not the case that no one wants it. Now, 80% of American universities do not require the SAT or ACT, but that 80% is not heavily represented in the top tier. It's not the colleges that most of my clients are aiming for. The third myth is that universities that are test optional don't really care whether you report scores or not. Why would someone believe this? Well, because the word test optional suggests that they're optional. And if you are like me and you taught in a university setting for a long time, you know that universities often don't tell the strict truth. I talked to an Ivy League admissions director who had just left his post in 2020, and he said, I think everyone knows that test optional doesn't mean, optional for everyone. And I told him, no, I don't think people understand that. I think many people take you at your word when you say it's optional. And this was um, uh, something that Ivy Leagues said to people. Our data in the early 2021, 2022 season that we dug up strongly suggested that even lower scores um, are very, very helpful in admission. Even students who submitted scores below the 25th percentile were accepted at a rate of 1.25 times that of students who didn't submit test scores. Um, um, and the Dartmouth president made it very clear in a New York Times um, piece in an interview. She basically said, we thought test optional would give us a more diverse body of students. But in fact, the students that we really wanted, the marginalized students who were disadvantaged, we discovered later that many who had 1400s below our average, but still within what we consider to be, very solid score, likely to thrive at a place like Dartmouth. Students hid those scores because they were worried that the Dartmouth would see that they were below their average. But Dartmouth said we wanted those students and we couldn't accept them because they kept their score a mystery. The president of Brown said standardized test scores are a much better predictor of academic success than high school grades. Um, uh, Optional test scores are not really optional, according to nearly every um, university when you kind of scratch beneath the surface. Um, I don't want to go into the weeds here, but universities want more applicants. They'll do almost anything to get more applicants. Test optional gives them more applicants that they're likely to reject, which makes them more selective. Universities want selectivity. Um, Test optional is almost certainly not an option for most of the students that I work with. Myth number 4 is one that utterly puzzles me. I've heard this from students who, especially in private schools, get to spend a lot of time with their counselor. Counselors are often telling kids, if your SAT and ACT scores aren't really great, aren't in the top 1%, don't report them. And here's one reason um, students and counselors might think this is true. If you look at what Harvard says about standardized test scores, first of all, this is not strictly speaking the truth, but Harvard says students who do not submit standardized test scores will not be disadvantaged in their application process. The other leaders of Ivy League schools have admitted in the test optional phase, many students were disadvantaged by not submitting scores. Harvard also had a message saying when they were openly engaging in racial preferences, that these preferences didn't disadvantage any students, they only helped others, but didn't disadvantage any other students, which, if you think about how admissions works, is almost nonsense, really. Um, Pomona says, you include them, don't include them, your decision. And this may be one reason why um, counselors have been telling some kids you shouldn't submit even a very good score, only submit the most amazing score. But you should not take colleges at their word when they tell you that they're optional and no one will be punished if you don't submit them. And I say this because there's a long history, more than a century, of American universities being less than honest and truthful with how they're making admissions decisions. This is a letter from 1970, and it is about a recollection of a lunch that someone had regarding Princeton admissions. I'm going to leave the first paragraph alone. It's a question that a person asked back in 1930, 31, 32 about why there are no African American students at Princeton. And the answer from admissions was, I don't know. They just don't seem to want to come. I'll let you decide if that seems like a truthful, honest answer. I will read the next paragraph. I asked how many Jews there were in Princeton. Mr. Hibben said, about 200. I said, how many were there last year? He said, about 200. I asked how many there were the year before that. He said, about 200. I said that was very odd and asked how it happened. He said he didn't know. It just happened. Mrs. Hibben was outraged and said, Jack Hibben, I don't see how you can sit there and lie to this young man. You know very well that you and Dean Eisenhart get together every year and fix the quota. That's a pretty stark view of how Ivy Leagues admitted people in the 1930s. And I would argue some lawsuits that are still working their way through the courts will almost certainly reveal quotas are not necessarily a thing of the past. If you want to know how universities speak to families and students and applicants, here's one example. And it suggests strongly to me that they're not always straightforward and honest. When you ask the UC Irvine bot this question, what majors at UCI are impacted? The answer is good news. UC Irvine, UCI doesn't have any impacted majors. That's great. No impacted majors. But then they say nursing, computer science, and business administration are the most highly selected majors. And then they offer a non sequitur. The average freshman retention rate, an indicator of student satisfaction, is 93%. This is simply put a lie. Nursing, computer science, and business administration are the most impacted majors at UC Irvine. Nursing at UC Irvine has less than 1% acceptance rate. It's just not honest to tell kids there's no impacted majors. What they're really saying is we're not going to use the word impacted, but indeed, these are highly impacted majors. I want you to think about this when well-meaning, hardworking counselors tell kids. A counselor at a private school told one of my clients he shouldn't submit his 1530 on the SAT. And her thinking was apparently, well, a 1530 is a little bit below the average for some of the superstar schools, maybe 10, 20 points below the average. So don't submit it. But a 1530 is in the top 1% on the SAT. And you have to really, really be naive to believe that when colleges say it's optional, don't send it, they wouldn't want to see a 1530, or that if you leave it blank, they will assume it was a 1580. This advice puzzles me, and it expresses a myth about the SAT. If you saw on a dating site that someone doesn't want a picture and they don't describe their height, you're probably not going to think, if you're a girl, very handsome, most likely, and probably 6'2". If you overhear a conversation in college of a couple and the hapless boyfriend asks his girlfriend, because her birthday's coming up, should I do anything? Would you like me to organize a party, a dinner? And you hear the girlfriend say to the boyfriend, well, you don't have to make a big deal about it. That is what she said, but it's very likely not what she meant. When universities say they are test optional, in my conversations that are not public, they all acknowledge no, they're certainly very, very important. Myth 5, about the SAT ACT is that the SAT is easier than the ACT, or the ACT is easier than the SAT. I was digging through YouTube and TikTok, and some woman was saying like, "Oh, everyone should take the ACT. It's a much better test. It's much easier." I don't really understand this whole one is easier than the other. They are not perfectly identical. There are small differences between them, and these differences could mean for you, one test will be easier to get a good score. But in fact, um, when we talk about a test being easier, we're thinking about a test like a driver's license exam, where you have to get so many right to pass. If you make the test easier, more people will get the threshold, and the test could be harder if you raise the standard. But the SAT and ACT, for many, many decades, are tests that describe a normal distribution curve. They describe a Gaussian curve. They are separating a population of test takers into a top 1%, a top 10%, a middle 50th percentile. Um, the SAT and ACT, no matter their slight differences and their many similarities, each will put 99% of the population not in the top 1%. The question isn't which is easier, but which is a better fit for you. I can tell you briefly, when the SAT, in a panic that the ACT was gaining popularity, when the SAT changed the formula, so to speak, of the SAT in 2016, we thought other test prep companies would probably do what we were doing, which is to teach the tests side by side, exploiting their conspicuous similarities. They were similar because the SAT just re-engineered their test to be very like the ACT. So we began in 2016 teaching the SAT and ACT alongside one another. What we discovered was the ACT is a little faster, but it is scaled differently such that it will not punish students who make one or two silly mistakes here or there. It's rounded up to a perfect 36. Perfect 36s were very rare um, until 2016, at least in San Diego. There were 5 teens, two of them from Westview, who got perfect 36s in San Diego. There's a San Diego Union Tribune story about them. They were, interviewed and had their hopes and dreams shared with the world. There were 5 in a year. Gosh, what state is it? Iowa, maybe? Nebraska. There were 17 kids in a year who got perfect SAT or ACT scores, and their stories were celebrated. We began teaching the ACT alongside the SAT, and ended up with 42 kids that year who got perfect ACT scores. If you look at, this is actually out of date, we now have 217 perfect scores. If you look at this list of kids who got perfect scores, the highlights are perfect ACT scores. 90% of our perfect scores are ACT. But that doesn't mean that the ACT is an easier test. It means it's 10 times more likely to produce a perfect score, but you need to be a fast processing speed student to take advantage of the ACT. The reason we want to train students to take both is because I can't know right away if one will be better. And even midsummer, we may not be sure. Almost always, for most people, the best strategy is to prep for both and then figure out if one is going to be a better fit. Another myth, number 6, is that the new digital SAT is easier because it is shorter and it is adaptive. Indeed, many writers, many journalists have said, the new digital SAT is going to be shorter. It has shorter passages, very short passages. Supposedly, it's going to have less time pressure. I would say that was more advertised than delivered. And it's adaptive. The first module in math and reading, if you do poorly, you'll get an easier section. This led some I would say, uninformed commenters to say, oh, well, then, this test is going to be much easier. But again, it's putting everyone on a normal distribution curve. Whether the test is digital, whether the test is shorter or longer, 1% will be in the top 1%. This is an interesting comment from I don't know, I mean, an article that someone did, and here's a person commenting on it. I'll just read a little bit of it. This is what a lot of people said when the digital SAT was announced. This is all pointless now with the new digital adaptive SAT. My son has taken it twice. Notice she doesn't tell us how well he did. He's a top math student, got fives on his math APs, did very well on the old PSAT normal test, not digital. But the actual SAT now literally adapts to the student halfway through the test. Like chasing a moving target. In reference to math section, specifically the way it works is those who answer well in the first half get much harder questions for the second half, whereas students who only do okay on the first half get easier questions. So smarter kids actually don't do as well or are pushed harder than average students. That's literally the opposite of a standardized test. This woman goes on to say, my son is in Mensa and was certified a genius at a young age. And just like with grade inflation, kids who don't do as well or know as much are getting the same grades and scores as him. So what's the point of preparing? I'm a little doubtful about the Mensa part because this person um, is missing something very obvious. These adaptive tests, to be shorter, do not give a wide range of problems. They give a medium set of problems, and if you do poorly, you then get an easy set of problems. We know you're not probably going to thrive in the harder problems. If you did really well in the medium problems, you get harder problems. But if you get the easy questions in the second module, your score will top out around a 600. You can't do great with the easy questions. Um, uh, in the new digital SAT, what we have found predictably is that the new digital SAT is telling us 99% of the people aren't in the top. In fact, we're seeing that the digital SAT is in many ways a harder test than people had anticipated. So this is another reason why we strongly recommend that you keep the SAT and ACT as part of your strategy to have both uh, in your pocket, so to speak. The meaning of an adaptive test has been misunderstood by almost everyone in mainstream media who's written about it. They all think it's going to be easier, everyone will do great. In our experience, the digital SAT is shorter. It's in a format that students seem to be comfortable with. They like being online on screens, but we've seen fewer perfect scores across the country and in our office on the digital SAT compared to older ones. Um, I would say since the ACT has to play the catch-up game and they've made a digital version, I'm still strongly recommending that you follow our guidance in terms of prepping for both when they're both new and we don't know what kinds of scores to expect. Um, Number 7, avoid taking the SAT, ACT when seniors are taking it because they will wreck the curve. I've heard this for almost 2 decades. Um, it's not ridiculous, but a test that's curved in the fashion of a college exam, we typically look at who did the best. If the best anyone could do was a 73%, that is pegged at 100. You would indeed be in a tough spot if typically a very challenging professor curves an exam, but there's a PhD candidate in the class and she gets 98% on this exam that typically people only score in the low 70s. She's ruined the curve. This thinking is if seniors are the predominant part of the cohort, they are maybe better equipped, they're stronger, they'll ruin the curve. But the SAT and ACT aren't curved in that way. They're curved in a fairly complicated looping fashion where they're looking at literally generations of other test takers. They're looking at experimental sections and how students did on particular questions. They're not just looking at that population of test takers on that day. The test is curved in a much more complicated way. And it is true that some versions of the test your student might find easier or harder, but it's not true that because it's in the fall and seniors are taking it, you should stay away from it. In fact, the bulk of our perfect scores come from the fall exams, which are typically thought to be dominated by seniors. The last myth that I want to talk about is don't take the SAT, ACT more than once because it will look bad to colleges. Um, I would say if you're trying to parallel park in front of a restaurant, if it takes you 5 attempts, you do look bad in front of people staring at you from inside the restaurant. Your date's probably not very impressed. And if I were to discover that a lawyer I was contemplating hiring needed to take the bar 6 times, um, I might find that um, not ingratiating. But when it comes to the SAT and ACT, um, taking the SAT 5, even 6 times seems to have no impact on how colleges see a student. I don't like students taking these tests 5 or 6 times because it eats into their lives. It causes them anxiety. But I have seen students who, on their 5th attempt, finally get the score that they need. And colleges seem to care only about that, not that they needed 4 attempts after their first one. The SAT, by the way, has relationships with some colleges where they will not want to know how many times you've taken it. Many colleges, including Yale, don't want to know how many times you've taken it, and you don't have to tell them. The ACT has extraordinarily robust privacy mechanisms. The ACT sees families and students as the customer rather than colleges, and they have a policy that says no college will see any ACTs you don't want them to see. So you could take the ACT 4 or 5 times and just send the one test that you like. Most of our students will send more than one test because what we call super scores, being able to combine components of tests over different test dates, can give you a stronger score. Nearly all private colleges in the United States are interested in what we call a super score, a composite score. Those are 8 things that time and time again come up about the SAT. Um, if I had to add a ninth, I'd probably say some people tell me, oh, I need to make sure that I take the SAT before, or rather, I take the PSAT before the SAT. You do not have to take the SAT before the PSAT. In fact, if you take it before or after, it makes no difference. I usually want students to consider when should you take the SAT, ACT? When you finish the appropriate math represented on the tests. For a lot of my students, that will be at the end of 10th grade. Algebra 3, 4, pre-calc, that's the highest level of math on these tests. If you wait a year, you've waited for those math skills to erode, and you've often waited until you're in the middle of a bunch of AP classes in 11th grade. Besides, the fall of 11th is when the PSAT really matters. It's when those scores from the 11th grade PSAT will contribute to national merit awards. So a pretty good strategy is to study in between 10th and 11th that summer, and then take several tests when you've prepared for the overlapping materials that they cover. I occasionally have ninth graders who finish pre-calc, they finish integrated math 3, they sometimes even finish calculus. Some students will study the SAT between 9th and 10th. In our office, we meet with everybody before we sign them up, even for tutoring, even for classes, because um, everyone has a slightly different path to a great college or a stepping stone, a good score. Um, I'm going to um, stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to see if anyone has any questions in the chat for me. It may be there. I see. Someone is asking me, do you recommend that eighth grade students take the SAT or ACT? I would say eighth graders should probably not take an official SAT or ACT. It is true that in the eighth grade, there's usually no record that will be permanent about your score. But I would really say if you're curious about an eighth grader's um, work on an SAT or ACT, um, if they haven't had integrated math two or three, um, it might be a little early to be having them think about that test. And you could always come to us and take one that is not official. There wouldn't be a record of it. It looks like someone else is asking. Yeah, the recording will be shared, including my embarrassing failure to adapt to my new computer and not share my screen right away. It is definitely not too late to start studying for the PSAT, ACT during the summer of 10th grade. Summer after 10th grade going into 11th is often ideal. That's often the very best time. I respectfully disagree with some counselors, usually at private schools, who say that it's best that you study at the end of 11th. Their argument is you'll be more mature, you'll be more prepared. But if the math on the SAT is math that you did in eighth and ninth grade or eighth, ninth, and 10th, you won't be better at the end of 11th. You'll have experienced more erosion of those math skills. Besides, for many students, especially if you can click the box that says you're Hispanic, your performance on the PSAT can be life-changing. You could be a National Hispanic Recognition Scholar. You could be a National Merit Finalist. And that is a test, the 11th grade PSAT, that is typically given in October. So studying in April or May in 11th for a test that's administered in October of 11th strikes me as puzzling because my strategy is always study and then take the test, not take the test and then study. Someone is asking if a student's super score is excellent, but the individual tests are lower, is there a reason to retake? I'm going to say no. Um, I have not met a college that really cares about how they got their super score. A 1570 would be an excellent score. And if you achieved it over two tests, I wouldn't worry about it. Someone is asking if there are SAT subject tests. They were eliminated, puzzlingly, they were eliminated. The research about SAT subject tests suggested that they were the single strongest predictor of success in college, which is not terribly surprising. They're subject-based tests. They were very um, strong predictors. Um, I'll leave it to others to figure out why in the world College Board eliminated them. I mean, it was, I think we're kind of rethinking almost all of those decisions about admissions. Um, Here's an excellent question. Someone is saying, what are your thoughts about how colleges may view the science section of the ACT since it will become optional? And I may invite Mr. John Pilliser to correct me or add more to this, but we've reached out to many colleges and we can't really find any who seem to think that they want the ACT science section. Um, I know that I just told you some things that they say are optional are not really optional, but the writing section, the essay on the uh, ACT and SAT were optional, and it turned out colleges just said, "Nah, we don't want them." Probably with ChatGPT, they should want them, but they don't. We're almost certainly moving into a phase where we assume the science section will probably be eliminated. And as anyone who's studied for these tests knows, the science section, um, in its name, it sounds like it'd be really useful for STEM students. But the science section is really just science topics in critical reading. The science section doesn't really have you do any science. It is reading graphs and reading scientific laden essays. So it probably won't be missed, frankly. Um, and are there any reading SAT classes you would? Yes, we have every variety of SAT class this summer. I would say we also recommend if you have a fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grader, ninth grader not yet ready for the SAT, they don't have to necessarily come to our office in the summer and take classes, although we'd be thrilled to host them. But your students should be reading. Frankly, we have had a wonderful moment where we are giving advice since 2020 that completely zigged when everyone else zagged. Mr. Pilasser helped me review a bunch of TikTok and YouTube videos where people said, "Oh, you don't need the SAT. Nobody wants it." It turns out that was disastrous advice to people. Um, when the president of an Ivy League school says, we thought test optional would give us a more diverse class, but we ended up not accepting exactly the people we wanted because they hid scores that weren't great but were good. That means they're not optional. Um, it was an advantage to know that these tests were meaningful, and it's an advantage to be to be a reader. We have SAT classes in the summer where we'll focus 75% of our classroom time on the reading and writing section, precisely because for many students, that is the difficult section. Looking at some statistics of the new digital SAT, we do this about once a week. The new digital SAT, if we look at scores nationally that are 700 to 800 in the reading section, only 2% of test takers on the digital SAT in the last year have earned scores 700 or higher. Um, Doing well on the reading section is going to be a secret weapon for the SAT. Um, the new digital SAT ACT is not taking it home. That's an excellent question. Someone is asking, can you take it at home? In my grumpy middle-aged perspective, what's the advantage of taking a test digitally if you have to still go to a school, sit at a school desk, and take the test in a school environment on a Saturday morning? That would be like Netflix having a model where you bring your laptop, uh, into a Netflix store and then you watch your movie there. That's essentially how the digital SAT is proctored. The ACT, it's a little unclear how it's going to be conducted. I've got some experts in my office who know more than I do about the details of it, but the digital SAT is taken at an actual test site. Um, and the ACT, the rumor is they're going to provide their own computers for students. Um, Seeing if there's any other questions maybe here. We do not have summer classes for AP Physics C. We do have spring classes, but we will have tutors who would be happy to provide um, something like an AP Physics program. In fact, we will always have things like that going on in the summer. In conclusion, I want to make sure people know you can send me questions um, through the office. You can send me questions through email. My email is just ch@hamiltoneducation.com. And you can come in and talk to us. Um, we don't always um, have an answer for everything, but in the last couple of years, I'm very, I'm very proud that we've proven to be kind of on the right side of some situations where there was a lot of debate and discussion. Um, a lot of people were very happy to tell kids no one wants the SAT, ACT. It just wasn't true. Even colleges that said they were optional. Purdue University, um, when the SAT was optional. Today, Purdue, a renowned engineering university in the Midwest, Purdue today says that they're test preferred. They would like scores. When I asked an admissions person at Purdue just 6 months ago, how preferred is the SAT at Purdue? She told me 3% of the accepted students last year, when it was optional, didn't submit scores. 97% of the acceptances came from students who submitted scores. She laughed a little when she said that. She even confessed that she thought test preferred wasn't really the most honest phrase. Um, um, I'm going to thank everyone for your time, for your attention. Apologize for the technical difficulties in the first 2 minutes. Thank you, Winnie, for your help. Um, Please send any other questions um, our way. We'll do our best to answer them thoughtfully. Hope everyone has a good week and everyone has a good evening. Thank you.